Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Our guest today is Father Cassian Folsom from the Benedictine Monastery in Norcia, Italy. Today we'll be discussing with Father Cassian how singing Gregorian Chant forms the spiritual life of the monks through the daily prayer of the Divine Office and the Mass. Father Cassian is American-born and studied music prior to entering the monastic community of St. Meinrad in Indiana. In 1998, he founded his monastic community in Rome, which then moved to Norcia in 2000. Being steeped in medieval monastic tradition, the monastery is known not only for its 2015 best-selling CD Benedicta, Marian Chant from Norcia, but also for its production of artisan beer.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Father Cassian.
I'm happy to be with you.
Could you tell us about the founding of the Monastery of St. Benedict in Norcia? What's the history of the monastery, and how did your community come into existence?
Well, actually, we were founded in Rome in 1998 and moved to Norcia in 2000 at the invitation of the local bishop who had wanted for a long time a community to be established at the birthplace of St. Benedict. The monastery had been suppressed by the Napoleonic laws in 1810, and so for almost 200 years there hadn't been monks at the birthplace of St. Benedict. So the bishop was very keen, and the population was very keen on monks taking up residence there once again. And so we arrived on December 2nd of the year 2000, a very small contingent. There were just three of us, myself, a novice and a junior, so it was a rather fragile beginning, but we were full of faith and perhaps reckless confidence.
What would you say, Father, that drew you personally to the rule of St. Benedict and living that life as a monastic?
Well, I joined the monastery 40 years ago in 1979, and at that time, as a callow youth, I knew nothing about the monastic tradition. I didn't have I had a Catholic formation all of my life, but I didn't know much about monks at all. So when I first encountered monks in my first year of university, I went to a secular university, I was just fascinated. And I suppose what drew me was a sense of stability, tradition, being rooted, the beauty of the liturgy, the common life, all those kinds of things combined. But there's a subjective factor too. When I first encountered the monastery, I entered the monastery at St. Meinrad in Indiana. When I first went there as a guest, it was a kind of falling in love experience. I was really sort of swept off my feet. So that was obviously the finger of God working in my life. And from that point on, I read everything I could about monastic life and eventually entered the monastery in 1979.
So you have training as a musician, though, don't you?
Well, a little. That is, my first year of university, I was in the conservatory at Indiana University as a voice student. So I only had formal training for 1 year, really. So I'm an amateur. I'm not a professional. But in the monastery, I've always been choir master or assistant choir master, so I've been singing from the very beginning.
So when most people think about Benedictine monks, they often think about the celebration of the liturgy, and especially a sung liturgy, the singing of Gregorian Chant. Could you enlighten us as to what the rule of St. Benedict actually talks about or says about sacred music in the life of the monk?
Well, actually, it doesn't say much of anything. St. Benedict says that our minds should be in harmony with our voices, and I suppose you could say that presupposes singing, but the rule itself doesn't say anything about music. It says a lot about the structure of the divine office. So actually the musical tradition is very ancient, but it comes from the Roman Church. That is, the old Roman chant and what came to be called Gregorian chant was kind of a natural environment for monks, and since it would be rather tedious to recite the office for hours a day, the singing of the office just became part and parcel of monastic life. The rule itself, however, doesn't talk about it.
So,
Fascinating.
could you explain a little bit more about what he does say about the role of the divine office? Of course, people are usually familiar with the phrase ora et labora, but could you maybe describe a little bit more about how he sees the divine office as an integral part of the ora part? And it's not just personal prayer or not just Eucharistic adoration, but specifically the recitation of the divine office.
That's what he spends most of his time on when he describes the liturgical life of the monastery. That is, the full divine office as laid out by St. Benedict takes about 5 or 6 hours a day. So it's a huge part of monastic life, and he regulates that with surprising detail. The principle is that the entire Psalter should be chanted in a 1 week period, and that prayer should be scheduled throughout the day so that it forms kind of the skeleton of the day, and everything else fits in around it. So the whole purpose of that kind of a structure is what the Desert Fathers would call praying without ceasing. That's what Benedict is after. But that's done in a formal, structured way, and classically speaking, everything is sung.
So you briefly mentioned the relationship of the Roman chant to the office, but most people might not be aware that there's really a difference between how a Benedictine recites the office versus what we would call a secular cleric, that being, a diocesan priest reciting the office. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the differences between the Roman and the monastic offices?
Yes, there has always been that difference from ancient times, and that is because the Roman office begins as a cathedral office. That is what was done in the cathedral of the bishop. Now, of course, that develops over time, but the monastic office tends to take more time, to be more involved. It doesn't think of the pastoral work of the parish priest, for example, which means that he wouldn't be able to spend as much time singing the psalms. It presupposes that that's the main thing that the monk has to do. That's saying things very briefly, and of course it's more complicated. But today, after the Second Vatican Council, the Liturgia Horarum of the diocesan priest, or let's say of the religious or of the laity, the Roman office now is very brief and formulated precisely that way so as to give people more time. But the monastic office is much longer. It's sort of like stick your foot into the water as opposed to diving in and swimming. So we spend hours and hours a day on the monastic office, whereas an ordinary parish priest might perhaps spend 45 minutes, an hour in one day.
Father, what is it about the spirit or qualities of Gregorian chant that accords so well with Benedictine life? What are the qualities that you'd see in chant that help to foster prayer in the life of a monk?
Well, I could summarize it by saying that it has a contemplative spirit, but that's a little bit vague, so I'd like to say a bit more precisely what I mean by that. There are two aspects of the chant. One is the text and the other is the music. The text is almost always from the Psalms or sometimes there are poetical compositions too that are non-scriptural, but it's basically the scriptures, and more specifically the Psalms. And the Psalms used according to the spiritual interpretation of the fathers of the church. That is not so much in the historical sense of each psalm, but in how that's interpreted in a spiritual way, in a Christological way, how the Psalms talk about Christ. So there's a wonderful richness in the text, biblically based. The music is specific to this prayer form. It's a music that's different from any other kind of melodic or rhythmic patterns that you hear in modern music, for example. So it's associated specifically with prayer. It's a style of music that's tranquil and peaceful. It doesn't have the kind of throbbing rhythms of sometimes, these. If you're driving on the street and you stop at a stop sign, and there's a car next to you that has one of these boom boxes that's boom, 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 boom. Well, chant doesn't have any of those kinds of rhythms. I would express it in a kind of paradox that also comes from a liturgical text, a hymn. St. Ambrose calls this sobria ebrietas, sober inebriation. And the chant, because of its, the inebriation is the kind of enthusiasm of the chant, and the sobriety is the form that it has, so that it's contained in a certain structure. And so you have this paradox of structure and enthusiasm, which makes for an extremely beautiful art form.
So you've talked a little bit about how the office takes up a large part of the monk's day. Could you tell us a little bit more about the daily orarium at the monastery?
Yes, at least in our monastery, because every monastery is a little bit different. We begin at 3:30 in the morning with matins. Matins is about an hour, and that's basically 12 psalms and readings. That's chanted recto tono because at that hour of the morning, your voice doesn't have a huge range. You're just kind of getting started. After a time of Lectio Divina, at 6 in the morning, we have lauds, and that's all sung according to psalm tones. Basically, 5 units of psalmody with their antiphons, and ending with the Benedictus. During the day, there are what we call the little hours, that is prime, terce, sext, and none. Prime takes a little bit longer, maybe 20 minutes. Terce, sext, and none about 10 minutes each. So these are little moments during the day that call you from your many occupations so that you remember God. One of the things that the monks try to do is to flee forgetfulness, as St. Benedict says, so that we remember the presence of God. It's very easy to forget. Toward the end of the day, there's Vespers, which is about a half an hour, and the bedtime prayer is called Compline. And because the Compline psalms in the monastic office are the same every day, they don't change like in the Roman office, the current Roman office anyway. Because they're the same every day, the monks memorize Compline, and so that's done in the dark with just the candles before Our Lady. It's kind of a bedtime lullaby that Our Lady sings to us or we sing to her. And that ends the day. And after Compline, we go to bed.
So a monk entering your monastery is entering because he has a vocation, not necessarily because he loves singing and just wants to sing the office every day. So
Right.
Perhaps you might get some monks that are musically adept and perhaps other monks who aren't very well trained in music. So how does a new monk learn how to sing the office? And are there parts of it that he memorizes besides Compline?
Yes, in terms of musical training, well, there are two aspects. You learn by doing, so you're just thrown into it, and you follow the community. Some of the community has been singing this for many years, so it comes naturally, and then the new person is just inserted into that. But we also have explicit music lessons for For the entire community, the choir master gives lessons to the entire community, but individual lessons to the new monks too, in terms of vocal production and the repertoire. So we spend a lot of time on chant training. In terms of memorization, just by doing the thing day after day after day, you very soon memorize large chunks of the office. And we have special classes for the novices on the Psalms, and the tradition, anyway, presumes that the monks will memorize the entire Psalter. Now, that's a little bit more difficult for us because we use the office in Latin, and so we use the Vulgate Psalter. It's a little harder to memorize than if you were memorizing in your mother tongue, but nonetheless, the young monks have wonderful memories, and they do a very good job at getting a lot of the repertoire memorized.
In learning the chant, do you have a specific textbooks that you use, or is it really just this interaction between the choir master and the monks, or the two that you have doing the vocal training and the monks?
It's pretty much whatever the choir master thinks is helpful because it's tailor-made to the individual. In terms of textbooks, there are various books that have been produced by Solem that are useful for chant training. What exactly the present choir master uses, I'm not sure, but there are resources out there, especially things from Solem, either printed today or from 50 years ago.
So this is on a different topic, but one related as well. A few years ago, you released a hugely popular CD with de Montfort music of Marian Chant. What do you think it is about Gregorian chant that draws the modern ear and heart to that music? Do you think there's a sort of spiritual remedy offered by the chant for the souls of modern people?
Well, it's very interesting that was so popular. Of course, we think it was good music, but the response was surprising to us. And I think that can be explained by a real hunger for some kind of spirituality. There are many people today who are not really concerned about creed and doctrine, in fact, might even reject that, but they're fascinated they have a spiritual hunger for something. And so we talk about spirituality, which is a bit vague. Nonetheless, it's there in the heart of every person that is the desire for God. And this kind of music taps into that because it's otherworldly. It's not like anything that they hear in other contexts. And because of its peaceful quality and contemplative quality, it releases, I think, a kind of intuitive aspect of the human person that can connect with divine things more easily than a rational process does. So, to summarize, it connects with this desire for God, even a vague desire, which we call spirituality, and it taps into this intuitive aspect of human knowing, by which we can grasp God more easily by intuition than by intellectual knowing.
Father, well, it seems that the chant of that CD has connected, across the globe. People identify with what you're saying of, the silence, the spirituality of the chant, the contemplative nature of it, and the peacefulness. That it seems that the music of chant, that's proof that it's relevant for not just monks, but for, people around the world, for all the faithful. Would you say that that's partly why in Vatican II it says that Gregorian chant has pride of place in the sacred liturgy in that regard?
Well, I would agree with your assessment, that is, that it has this kind of natural attractiveness for people across the board. But the Council emphasizes that it's the music proper to the Roman Rite, and not only for those reasons, but because of the long tradition. That is, if you examine the liturgical books, the texts of the chant go back to the 8th century, and the music that is when the music was actually written out, because it was passed on by oral tradition before that. The musical notation goes back to the 9th and 10th century. We have over a millennium of singing these same chants on the same liturgical day over and over, year after year. So it's our, in a certain sense, it's our mother tongue. It's the way we express ourselves to God. It's the identity of our liturgical prayer. And that's why it's proper to the Roman Rite. That is our tradition. That is our language. Other kinds of music, both polyphony and other kinds of things, including modern compositions, they're sort of grafted onto the tree. But the tree is Gregorian chant, and there's no, that's just a fact.
Yeah, I like that, how, you can approach the appropriateness of chant for the liturgy from many different angles, that make it justifiable. It's not, a one reason or one trick pony in that sense. What would be your advice to a pastor or a music director who might be nervous about implementing the use of chant in their parish because it may not be well received? Or one of the things I've come across in my experience is sometimes, since chant is not inherently emotive and doesn't immediately connect with the emotions, if that's what people are used to, that can be a difficult transition. So what would be your advice to pastors and music directors in that regard?
Yeah, that's a complex question. I'd like to address it by going back a century to Pius X and his motu proprio in 1903, whereby he wanted to promote Gregorian chant as the way of participating in the liturgy. And after that document, in many places, these little schools grew up for the teaching of chant. And not only specialized schools, but also in parish schools. So children at a young age were introduced to the ordinary of the Mass, for example, the Kyrie and the Gloria and so on. And young children have a remarkable capacity for learning things, and they take to it like ducks to water. So it's not that it's inherently difficult to teach or to learn. So there was a real movement after Pius X of learning parts of the Mass, especially the ordinary parts in the chant. Now, that means it can be done. What the pastor today has to deal with is what I would call roadblocks or obstacles, more often psychological or ideological than anything else. That is, there's a reluctance, or there can be a reluctance to learn the chant because it's in Latin, and some people have an allergic reaction to Latin, or because it sounds foreign, or as you say, as you just mentioned, it doesn't immediately touch, it's not sentimental. It doesn't immediately touch the emotions, although in a profound way it certainly does. And so people aren't familiar with it, and they're perhaps afraid of it. It's this difficult, challenging musical form. Well, I think it takes, people have to hear it done well so they can hear how beautiful it is and how wonderful it is. And I think there has to be a kind of gradual exposure of the parish to this kind of sound, so that people see, oh, this is really beautiful. If it's imposed on them, then they'll rebel against it, as we rebel against anything that's imposed. So I think it's a very gradual process, but you want to introduce people to beauty, and if they experience this beautiful music that draws them to God, then I think they'll be convinced that it's worth all the effort to do it, because it's not something superficial that you can pick up in just a moment. It's an art form that requires formation and training. So you're really talking about liturgical formation of the parish.
Yeah, I think that kind of connects with even my personal experience of whenever you're trying to introduce a new kind of music to people who haven't heard it before, you don't change everything. You have to introduce the new aesthetic of a sound if they're not familiar with.
Right, that's right.
With
that's right.
certain kinds of music, you try to emphasize the similarities with what they're familiar with, but try to open a door for them to experience something new.
So I'd like to end on a little bit of a lighter note, Father. One of the things that the monastery in Norcia does is produce beer, which is also an inherently monastic activity. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you came to the decision to start making beer and maybe a little bit of what the beer is like?
Yes, that happened about 5 years ago. We were looking for a work that the community could do together that would actually produce some income. We've always worked very hard, but most of the work that we do doesn't produce income. So one of the monks who had done home brewing as a hobby before he entered the monastery, he came across a book and passed it to me one day saying, "Here, take a look at this." And the title of the book was Brew Like a Monk. And it was the story of a beer specialist who was taking a tour through Belgium to the breweries of various Trappist monasteries, because in Belgium they have a long tradition of brewing beer. And I read this book and thought, well, gee, if these Trappists can do it, so can we. So I went to Westvleteren, one of these Trappist monasteries, where the monks themselves do the brewing. They don't farm it out to some company, but they do it themselves. And the monks were very welcoming and very cordial and showed us what they did. And so we decided, well, we can probably do this. We had some generous benefactors who allowed us to purchase a small brewery because the equipment is expensive. The raw materials are not, but the equipment is. And a couple of our monks who had the skills were trained in this Trappist Belgian tradition. So our beer is a Belgian-style beer. Very good, I must say. And it's available in the United States through our website. In any case, the beer also became very popular along with the chant recordings because it's a way for people to connect with the monastery. And they say, well, gee, if these terribly strict monks make beer, they must be okay. So it's kind of a ticket, an acceptance ticket. So I recommend it to you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Father. We are grateful for your insights into the monastic life and your insights into the spirituality of Gregorian Chant, too. So thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be with us.
Well, it was a pleasure, and I hope people are inspired to listen to some chant and to sing some chant.
Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this episode with Father Cassian Folsom. I know for me, it's refreshing to hear him talk about his love for prayer and Gregorian chant and his monastic life, and I feel inspired to try to integrate those aspects more in my own vocation as a church musician. And I think I'll be integrating the Norcia beer as well.
Definitely the beer.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time here on Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.